I was somewhere around the age of 12 years old whenever one of the greatest movie lines in history was ever uttered. The year? 1989. The movie, Field of Dreams. The line was not, "If you build it, they will come." One of the greatest lines ever uttered in movie history was uttered by the character John Kinsella as he walks out onto a baseball field and utters these words, "Is this heaven?" To which his son, played by Kevin Costner, responds, "No, it's Iowa." Now, in my opinion, neither Iowa nor baseball field, apologies to you, John, are heaven. To me, the best representation of heaven is an authentic Mexican restaurant. Now, growing up in rural Indiana, the closest thing that we had to authentic Mexican cuisine was Taco Bell, just a few streets down the road from Sizzler. But I thought, growing up, that Taco Bell was the height of Mexican food. And then somewhere in my mid to late 20s, for the first time, I walked into an authentic Mexican restaurant for the first time, and I felt genuinely as though I had been lied to for my entire life. It's like walking into a room in your house that you never knew existed before. Now, I know food. I am far from a novice whenever it comes to eating. I come from a long line of Midwestern farmers descended from the Appalachian pioneers who first planted the Midwest with tobacco and corn and soybeans and all manner of vegetables of all kinds. And what we did not in rural Midwestern Indiana know about fajitas or frijoles, we more than made up for in our agricultural know-how. My grandfather, chief among the agricultural knowers, was something of a seed whisperer. His name was Delbert, which feels quite fitting for a Midwestern farmer. Now, my grandfather, though, never planted a single seed without first walking the entire field he was about to plant. He would kneel down, literally getting on one knee, grab a handful of dirt and smell it. Then he would allow it to crumble between his fingers, and somehow or other through that process, he would know exactly what the field would do before he had ever planted a single seed. And he didn't do any of that for show. He did it for survival. You waste seed, you waste money. You waste money, your family doesn't eat. And so whenever we come to today's text, what has been referred to as the parable of the sower, we are firmly planting ourselves inside an agricultural metaphor which some of us may or may not understand at the depths to which my grandfather did, or first century hearers of Jesus' first telling of this story may have. So many of us, our understandings of this passage come from what we were taught, either from behind pulpits such as this one, or Sunday school classes, or our grandmother or grandfather's name. So as Jesus tells this parable in Matthew chapter 13, he lists out 4 types of soil, which you may or may not caught when we were reading it just a few moments before. And they are intentionally, Jesus tells us, to somewhat represent the state of our heart, or the receptivity to the good news of the gospel. He lines 4 different categories out. The first one, the path, or the hard soil, where the seed falls but is unable to penetrate the hardness of the ground, and the seeds are eventually eaten by birds. The second category that he gives is the rocky ground, where the soil, the good soil, is very shallow, but beneath, hidden underneath that thin layer of good soil, is rock, which prevents those roots from taking root strongly enough to allow the plant to survive. The third category that he gives is the thorny ground, the weedy ground, where the problem with the ground isn't underneath, The problem is clearly visible. It's there on the surface, and the thorns and the weeds crowd out the plant, so it's not able to get the nutrients from the sun or the water that it needs to survive. The fourth category is the good soil, the fertile ground, the ground that my grandfather always hoped for, that was rich, that was cultivated, where those seeds would take root, they would grow, and would yield, as Jesus says, almost in an exaggerated manner, 30 or 60 or 100 times what was planted. And I can remember in Sunday school and pulpits like these, hearing these four categories of soil being laid out, and then the preacher wiping the sweat off of his brow, lifting his hands high up into the air, pounding the pulpit, and then shouting, "What type of soil are you?" You've been there, right? What type of soil is your heart? He would shout for a few more moments, ask everyone to bow their heads and close their eyes, nobody looking around, and he was looking around, and we all were looking around as well, because we wanted to see who was raising their hands and who was coming forward. And every pastor, after preaching that sermon, wants to see the altars filled with people, right? People who realized that they were the hard ground. People who realized that they were the rocky soil. People who realized that they were the ones with thorny ground. Now, of course, every pastor wants a congregation that is that fourth type of soil, the good type of soil, but truly that doesn't make a great scene, right, on Sunday mornings. So there's always kind of this part of pastors who kind of hope there are lots of thorny people out there. Lots of rocky people out there who are going to get their lives changed because of this sermon. And I tell you, it's not much easier sitting out on the pews, right? I mean, this is stressful. If you've ever been in one of those sermons, you begin to kind of self-reflect and think, is this me? What am I? Where am I? And as all that pulpit pounding is happening, you're kind of doing a performance review, right? A self-checkup on yourself. And, you're kind of thinking, even though you might have walked in feeling pretty good about yourself, you're sitting there wondering, maybe that's not true. What kind of ground am I? How many birds are in my field that I'm not certain of this morning? How many rocks are buried deeply that I'm not aware of? Or how many thorns are there that are going to crowd out all of this good stuff in my life? And how do I clean all of this up? I need to turn myself into a well-tilled, well-weeded, well-fertilized field for the sowing of God's Word. But as I begin to do the math on this, I realize that the odds are kind of stacked against me. As Jesus tells this story, there's only a 25% or so chance that I'm going to end up on the right side of this story. It's kind of 3 against 1. It's the hard ground, the stony ground, the thorny ground against the good ground. And so at best, my odds just simply aren't great, and I'm sitting there worrying and sweating about what to do. Already pretty sure that I failed the test before it's even given. And then Jesus ends this 4-category sermon with, whoever has ears, let them hear. Or in today's vernacular, let the reader understand. And I'm honestly not so sure that we have understood. It's a bit like Jesus is kind of tapping the table here and he's saying, there's a little bit more here than what you're seeing. Wake up, pay attention, maybe look again, maybe look a second time. And if we miss it, honestly, I think that's okay, because the parables are not children's stories, even though it's typically the stories that we tell to children. They're not really children's stories. Parables are some of the most difficult things to understand, to translate, to figure out anywhere in Scripture, sometimes even more difficult than Revelation. Parables are not platitudes. They're not like Aesop's fables or happy stories. They're really not meant to be tame. They're not intended to be easily understood. In fact, Jesus says that on many occasions, that there's things that are hidden here that are intentionally trying to prevent everybody from kind of easily figuring out the meaning. They're somewhat difficult to interpret. They're designed to surprise us. to challenge, to shake us up just a bit. And sometimes they are designed to invite us and to make us feel uncomfortable. But if we stop with the easy lesson, or if we stop with the easy discomfort, good as though those children's or easy to understand lessons may be, we might lose what the original hearers would have heard whenever Jesus gave these stories. We might miss what he really wanted us to understand. These things should provoke. They should confront us in ways that aren't comfortable. They should disturb us. And I'll tell you, there is something in this text that I haven't pointed out, and that for many decades I never noticed, that does disturb me. There is something in this text that provokes me. And as the descendant of the great American farmers of the Midwest, there is one thing that I can assure you about the subject of today's text given by Jesus. And the one thing that I can assure you about today's text is that it is not about the terrain. Today's text is not about the soil. And so in order to try to convince you why that is, I want to bring to bear all of the generational knowledge that has been embedded into me by my agricultural ancestors in this moment. I want you to lean in, to listen closely, to sit on the edge of your seat and put on your listening ears. Because here it is. It is not the terrain that provokes me about this text. It is that this is, by far, the stupidest farmer of all time. Hands down, there is simply put no contest for the award of worst farmer ever. This sower takes it. He throws seeds literally everywhere. This is the Homer Simpson seed farmers. Hard pot, rock the ground, This is a man who has never read a single book about agriculture. This is a sower who has clearly never taken Planting 101. This is a sower who has never looked at the back of one of those seed packets that you buy at Home Depot or Lowe's. If there was a Yelp review for local sowers, this man would have a 1-star rating and the comment would read 10 out of 10 would avoid. So what is it about this that should disturb us? It isn't the state of the soil, it isn't the state of our soil, but what should really be disturbing us about this text is the ineptitude of the sower. You couldn't be this bad even if you tried. You couldn't be this bad as a novice seed grower. You don't have to grow up in rural Midwestern America to be better than this. You don't have to be an adult. A child could not sow seed as badly as this. A blind individual could not sow seed as badly as this sower sows seed. And that's what disturbs me. It disturbs me because this stupid farmer is whom Jesus ostensibly compares to God. And that just gnaws me. It bothers me that Jesus would compare God and compare the gospel, the good news, and its spread to this nitwit. And it should disturb everybody who hears this, and I think it probably would have disturbed those who heard it first. You see, in the first century, to the people whom Jesus is teaching this lesson to, they understood because grain was extraordinarily expensive. It was not something that they would have been okay, 75% of which going to waste. That would have stopped them in their tracks, and they would have not been focused on the soil at all. They would have been focused on the same thing that's disturbing me about this, the ineptitude of the sower. Farmers were careful to only throw seed on ground that was already plowed and fertilized. I'm telling you, it's not that difficult to do, even if you've never set foot in a field. So something else must be missed here. There must be something else that Jesus wants us to see and understand, something that might be just a bit hidden beneath the soil. And to be honest, we have to admit that Jesus honestly kind of muddies the water here, because he seems to, in the explanation, right, focus on the soil. What are you? What am I? But Jesus never poses those questions about the soil. If you go back and read his quote-unquote explanation, he never draws that conclusion to us or to our lives or to our soil as though we should do a performance review on ourselves. He does point out that there are different types of people with different types of soil. But Jesus doesn't make that connection that we should be doing performance reviews on ourselves or on others. He just simply gives us the first step that tells us that this story isn't just a story about soil, but this is a story about people and how there are different types of people. And then Jesus just kind of shuts up and moves on to the next parable. But he never tells us to rate our soil or others' soil. And yet that's what we spend all of our time doing as pastors pounding pulpits and people sitting in pews. And in fact, here the context even seems to indicate the disciples really aren't supposed to pay attention to other people's soil. They're just simply to proclaim the gospel, to spread the good news, to throw seed. Because, frankly, and Jesus says this over and again, you can't really know what type of soil someone is by looking at them. Right? I mean, that whole man looks on the exterior, but only God sees the inside. That the people who you might think are good soil might well be thorny ground. And vice versa. They can't judge insiders and outsiders to the kingdom of God. They can't judge who's really a disciple and who's a part of the crowd. They can't judge who's the saved and who's the damned among them. And the truth of the matter is that we have a really difficult time judging ourselves as well, right? I mean, that's why we sit sweating in church pews during sermons, oftentimes wondering, is it I, Lord? Because we're complex. Sometimes it's easier to judge someone else than it is to judge ourselves, seemingly. And the story implies that soils don't change. The story kind of implies that you're one of four, but I've watched fields change. I've watched soils change. Even in one of Jesus' other parables, it turns, the story does, on the improvement of soil. Soil can be made more productive. Rocks can be cleared away from beneath the ground. Thorns and weeds can be removed. Even seeds that are eaten by birds eventually pass through that bird and return back to the ground. No seed is lost, not even those that are eaten. I'm going to hit pause for just a moment and make sure that you've not fallen asleep and say that again. No seed is lost. And none of the four soils, even the seeds that are eaten by birds, return. No seed is lost. That is good news. That is the gospel. No seed is lost. No person is lost. No one is without the possibility of redemption. You see, the focus here is not on us. The focus here is not on our shortfalls or the state of our soil, unless it's to remind us of how bad our soil can get through the trauma and drama of this world. But the focus in this parable is on the generosity of the sower. The focus in this parable is not on an obsession with the condition of the fields. Think about it. The sower here is not stingy. The sower here is not cautious. The sower here is not judgmental. The sower here is not practical. This isn't the parable of the soil. This is the parable of the sower. A foolish, extravagant sower. And as typical, we tend to make everything about ourselves, and this parable isn't. We shouldn't be centering ourselves in the soil. We should be centering God. A God who is foolish, who is extravagant in his generosity. There's a phrase that I like to use for that: wholly abandon. The sower here practices holy abandon. And God, in the figure of the ridiculous sower, has abandoned the careful, the prudent, the strategic approach to grace. Here, God has thrown down the clipboard. He has stopped consulting the soil reports. He has stopped looking at the farmer's almanac. God has looked at the hard path and at the thorny ground and at the rocky hillside, and he's just said, I'm simply going to throw seed there anyway. Just as much as on the good ground. And it's not incompetence. That's a choice. Because here's what we know about God. He's not unaware of the conditions of any of those soils there. He's not ignorant of the rocks or the thorns. He's the one who created the soil itself. He invented the seeds. He knows exactly what he's doing, and yet he still does it anyway. The theological scandal of this parable is not that some seeds fall in bad soil. No, the theological scandal of this parable is that the sower just doesn't care. Not in a negligent way, but in a lavish way, in a way that a person has more than enough, and so without counting, they just spread grace and love and peace and hope to everyone, everywhere. Nothing is rationed. It isn't distributed based on merit. It isn't distributed based on the state of where it falls, the rocks, the thorns, the good soil. It's given everywhere, simultaneously, generously, and wastefully. And that should bother us, because if we're honest, we like a God who's at least somewhat strategic, right? We prefer a God who blesses the people like us who show up. We prefer a God who blesses those who do the work, or at least a little bit of work, who have the right soil. We like a God who has standards, because if God has standards, then we who have worked so hard to meet those standards can feel better about ourselves. But God in this parable doesn't seem interested in us feeling better about ourselves for having done more than somebody else. He seems more interested in throwing seed on people that I don't like, on people who walked out of church angry, throwing seed on the person who said they would never, ever believe, throwing seed on the people who identify as atheists or agnostic, throwing seed on the addict just a block away who has relapsed for the 18th time and shows up knocking on the door or sitting on the steps when you're walking in. Throwing seed on the people who you have written off, who go Democrat or Republican, who watch CNN or MSNBC or Fox News. All of those people equally receive God's generosity. It makes me angry. And it should. That's why Jesus told it in the first place. That is holy abandon. God not waiting for you to get your soil right. God not waiting for me to get my soil right. God not waiting for others to get their soil right. But just blessing everyone. This is the gospel. This is the good news. And if this is the only gospel or the only good news that we have, then the really disturbing thing about this story is that it seems that God even saves people that we don't want saved. And if this is the only thing that we know about the gospel or the good news, it also implies that Jesus saves everyone. No matter the state of the soil. You can't earn God's generosity by tending your fields. There's a diary entry from a Japanese man visiting America who went to a Mexican restaurant for the first time. And this is that journal entry. We sat at a table in a bright, loud eating house. Before the menu was even presented, a new delivery arrived with alarming speed. We had not yet ordered anything, and the food was already arriving. Chips, salsa, unrequested. Wait. I stopped the waiter and I said, "We have not earned these." To which the waiter responded, "They come with a table, man. They come with a table. In my land, hospitality has a debt. Every gift creates an obligation, weighed carefully, returned in proper season with interest. Here, the gift arrives before you have even proven that you can pay for dinner. This is not an appetizer. This is a declaration. We trust you. Eat." So I ate with the gravity that the moment deserved, and then I must report this calmly when the basket was empty, a new one appeared, full, a second time. I stopped the waiter. "Did we order?" The waiter interrupted me. "Refill," he said. "It's bottomless." Bottomless. Bottomless. They have wells of salsa in this country. The supply lines are beyond anything my ancestors imagined, and my friend leaned over and warned me, "Don't fill up on the chips, dude." But it was too late. I had already accepted 3 whole baskets of free chips. Honor demanded that I must finish every single one that was put on the table. Otherwise, it would be an insult. And by the time the actual food arrived, I was a ruined man. I wasn't hungry. I was uncomfortable. I had been defeated by generosity. Generosity that arrived before the request. So it could not be repaid. It could only be survived. Generosity that arrives before the request cannot be repaid. It can only be survived. For me, the best representation of heaven is not Iowa or a baseball field. For me, the best representation are free chips and salsa at a Mexican restaurant. Generosity that arrives without any payment from me. Something that can only be survived. And maybe that's what faith is. Maybe that's what the Christian life is not earning, not asking, not praying, not perfecting your soil, not making sure that you have the right kind of ground. Maybe the Christian life is just simply surviving the generosity of God. Maybe it's letting your basket come. Maybe the Christian life is not being so proud or so self-sufficient or so certain that you do not deserve good things, that you push good things away. Maybe the Christian life is just simply recognizing that the sower has already been in your field. Whether you have invited him there or not, whether your soil is ready or not, he is there. And maybe that is heaven on earth.